Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in conversation with Professor Loretta Ross. My name is Jessica Chiraboga. I am an ambassador for the Dartmouth Political Union, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I would like to thank the entire Dartmouth Political Union executive team, as well as Darshna Griggs and Catherine Dara, for all the hard work that went into making this incredible event possible. For those who have not been to a DPU event previously, we are a nonpartisan organization committed to issue-based conversations from all political perspectives. We aim to create an understanding environment of free thought on our campus. We host a diverse group of speakers to unpack the most pressing national issues, and also host regular social events and student debates for our members. Our speaker tonight is esteemed activist and academic, Professor Loretta Ross. Loretta Ross is a professor at Smith College and author of an upcoming book, Calling in the Callout Culture. Professor Ross has dedicated her life to advocating and organizing for racial justice, access to abortion, and combating certain forms of cancel culture in popular society. In 1978, Loretta worked at the first rape crisis center in the country as a part of the growing women's movement. In the 1990s, she fought against hate groups such as the KKK and co-founded Sister Song, an organization dedicated to improving institutional policies and systems that impact the reproductive lives of marginalized communities. She currently teaches courses on Callout culture and white supremacy at Smith College. Her work in transformative human rights has inspired and improved the lives of so many. You can find Loretta and learn more about her incredible work at lorettajross.com. Just as a reminder, any views expressed by our wonderful speaker today are not endorsed by myself or by the Dartmouth Political Union. Today's event will begin with 30 minutes of moderator-guided questions and answer, and end with 30 minutes of your questions. In order to ask a question, please find the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Also, make sure to upvote the questions you like. If you don't wish to ask the question with your own voice, you can also ask the question anonymously. But if you do wish to use your own voice, which we would love, we will let you unmute and you can ask your question. It is important to note that this event is being recorded and your question may be uploaded to YouTube. So with that, it's my great honor to introduce Loretta, and we will get into our Q&A. Awesome. So to start off with our first question, Loretta, I wanted to talk about your experience fighting white supremacy. So I wanted to ask, how did you get involved in fighting white supremacy, and what sparked your interest in that line of work?
Well, I was actually between jobs in 1990 when the executive director of the Center for Democratic Renewal, formerly the National Anti-Klan Network, called me and asked me if I would take a job as their program director. And at first I was a little concerned because I'd never worked in the civil rights movement. I'd only been a feminist. And so I used to walk around saying, I don't know if I should take this job because I don't have any problem sleeping with men, but working with them is a whole nother thing. And so, because the civil rights movement was decidedly patriarchal. And I was living here in Atlanta, which is the home of the civil rights movement. So I didn't think that I'd be a good fit. But my boss, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was the chair of our board of directors, had been an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Baptist minister, and once I talked to Reverend Vivian and heard how progressive he was on women's issues, on LGBT issues, on everything that I cared about, that I knew I'd found a political home. And so I spent the next 5 years working around hate groups, with first working with towns that had hate group violence happen, or marches and stuff, and helping the people deal with those marches and the consequences thereof. And then when our research director retired, Leonard Seskin, I took over the research department. And so I became the first woman, and particularly the first African American as well, who ran a major opposition research department. And it was in that guise that I started continuing the work that I begun with Leonard, which was deprogramming white supremacists who wanted to defect from the movement. But Reverend Vivian had said something to me very important. And he said, when you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand or even agree with Reverend Vivian when he first told me that, because I mean, if a Black woman can't hate the Klan, I mean, who's left? But once I started to work with these people who had defected from the movement, and let's be clear, they always had their epiphanies before they met me, even though Hollywood tried to say that one guy left because he fell in love with a Black woman, ignoring the fact that I don't go around falling in love with Nazis. But anyway, once I met them, I couldn't hate them anymore. I couldn't see them as representatives of a hate group so much as individual people with pain that had led them to the hate movement in the first place. And they had actually had their own wake up calls and decided that they didn't want to live in that netherworld of hate anymore. And so they reached out to my organization, and we kind of had an underground railroad to help them because they didn't want to turn state's witness and turn themselves into the FBI and stuff. They just wanted to get back into a normal life. And so we used a lot of progressive churches and things to help them relocate sometimes, find housing and clothing sometimes, because sometimes they left in the middle of the night without taking anything, even a coat, because they were escaping some very criminal friends that they'd been hanging out with. And so that work transformed me, and it really made me rethink everything that I thought I knew about nonviolence wasn't true. Everything I thought about the civil rights movement wasn't true, and really helped me become a much better person and understand how complicated people actually are.
Awesome, awesome. And so I'm sort of curious in that train of thought of thinking about what motivates and specifically the pain white supremacists you mentioned felt. What were sort of the factors? Was it economic pain? Was it family pain? What motivated white supremacists to join these hate groups?
The reasons are as varied as you can imagine. Floyd Cochran, who had become the chief spokesman of the Aryan nations and has really successfully recruited a lot of alienated young kids to the Aryan nations, the young skinheads, he became a Nazi because he was getting bullied. He was living in this all white town in upstate New York, and because he was of slight stature, people used to bully him and pick on him. And I'm not quite sure how he got hold of Mein Kampf, but he did. He started reading this Nazi literature. And then he found out that when he put on a swastika, instead of him being afraid of people, people were afraid of him. And so that's one story that I know of. Most of them came from families of violence or neglect. They had some pre existing trauma in their lives that led them to seek out some place where they could be affirmed, where they could be listened to, where they could be made to feel like they were important and respected. And unfortunately, people who recruit to things, cults and things like that, take advantage of disaffected people and offer this pseudo home, pseudo sincerity, pseudo caring for them, which isn't actually very real, but they play it very well because they know that they are best recruiting and trying to speak to the needs of feeling loved, respected, and heard that we all have. But they offer that to people who are alienated in one way or another, either the incels who can't get a date, or the people who get bullied, or the young women who didn't think they'd ever get a date, that kind of thing. And that's who they generally focus on recruiting. Occasionally, people come into the movement because their family was in the movement and they were raised in the hate movement. But more generally, what I find is that the kids whose parents were in the hate movement usually rebelled and went totally opposite. But then I've found other kids whose parents were in the progressive or the feminist movement who rebelled and went the other way too. So there's no real predicting what circumstances will cause somebody to join the hate movement, but pre-existing family trauma is a good predictor of whether they join the hate movement or whether they join the human rights movement. Either way, they're going to seek a place where they feel loved, respected, and heard.
That's so insightful. Thank you so much for that. So in 1992, you actually began a national atonement tour with Floyd Cochran, the former national spokesman for the Aryan nations, as you mentioned. How did that happen?
Well, Floyd suggested it himself because he felt very guilty about things he'd done while he was working with the Aryan nations. And one particular thing that he really regretted was that he recruited these two brothers named Freeman from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And these children had become more and more alienated from their families. I think they were 16 and 17 years old at the time. And even the sad part is that their mother had reached out to me, Brenda, had reached out to me on a Wednesday because she said she was very afraid of her sons and she didn't know what to do. She had tried calling the police, she'd called the Human Relations Commission, she tried getting them counseling, she went through her church. I mean, she just tried everything that she could think of. And so she called my organization down in Georgia from Pennsylvania asking for help. And there wasn't a whole lot we could do long distance, but I did advise her to change the locks on the door because the children were actually issuing death threats. Brenda didn't want to do that though, because she was afraid that she'd make her own children homeless. And she didn't want a tough love approach. She just thought that they could change some kind of way and magically reconnect with the family. That was on a Wednesday. And that Saturday, the boys came home and murdered the entire family, the mother, the father, and their 12-year-old brother. And Floyd had recruited them to the Aryan nations. And so he felt particularly guilty that he was an influencer of them. I mean, through him, they got Nazi tattoos on their foreheads and stuff like that. And so the Atonement tour was Floyd's way of paying it back. He wanted to reach as many other alienated young people as possible and tell them the real story of his life in the Nazi movement and how hard and awful it was, and how he was surrounded by endlessly stupid people that he was a lot smarter than. And he wanted to do that. And so we not only toured to a number of cities, we ended up on, I hate to say this, on the Jerry Springer show, which is not something you put on the resume. But he also displayed a courage I didn't think he had, because even if you've given up Nazism, doesn't mean that you've given up all the other hatreds in your life. And he was still probably not being very faithful to his girlfriend or his wife. I never knew which one she was. And one of the tests we put before him was to go testify, I think it was in Montana, for a hate crimes bill that included LGBT people. And we thought that Floyd needed to prove to himself that he had really changed. And so we took him to Montana, and he did a great job testifying about the reality of being in the neo-Nazi movement. And I fell out of contact with Floyd, for the last 25 or 30 years, because I never knew what happened to him. He had started this group called Education and Vigilance, trying to work with disaffected youth. But I just heard from a reporter that he has recently located Floyd, and I'm hoping to get a call from him one day just to connect and find out what's happening in his life in the 30 years since we lost each other.
Wow, well, we'll have to all check out your website to see the latest update on that if you're able to get in contact. So this theme of forgiveness and atonement resonates in your work, obviously combating white supremacy. But we're curious, did any element of this work affect your perspective on this idea of call-out culture?
Well, yes, but it actually started before then. because when I was 25 years old and the director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, I was both a rape and incest survivor myself. As a matter of fact, I was incested by a cousin who thought that it was a good idea to get me drunk so he could have sex with me. And he basically disregarded that he was 27 years old and married and I was 14. He should not have been doing that. But I wasn't smart enough or sexually aware enough to even know what was happening because my parents mistakenly thought that keeping me sexually innocent was the way to protect me, not tell me what was going on in life or with my body. So, anyway, I ended up having a son through incest and choosing to keep him. So, I was basically co parenting with my rapist, even though my cousin and I never saw each other again, but my son got to know his dad because that was very important to him. But anyway, when I was at the DC Rape Crisis Center, we got this letter from a guy who was incarcerated for raping and murdering a Black woman named William Fuller. And William wrote this letter that I could almost quote: outside, I raped women. Inside, I raped men. And I'd rather not be a rapist anymore. Can you help? And that letter landed like a bombshell at the Rape Crisis Center because it happened before I came. So I can't say that I got the letter, but the people there before me got the letter. But we didn't know what we were going to do with it. So it just sat around, sat around. And then I finally decided to do something about it. And so he was incarcerated in Lorton Reformatory outside of Washington, D.C., where I was in D.C., 20 miles outside of D.C. in a very rural area. I went down to Lorton just to see what was up because he'd asked us to teach him about Black politics, Black feminism. Apparently, what had happened with William was that he was 17 years old, I believe, and he was convicted for life for raping and murdering a woman. But by the time he reached us, he was in his mid 30s. So he had apparently taught himself to read, somehow got hold of some Black feminist literature while he was reading. And that's what made him contact the Rape Crisis Center to ask for help. So when I went down to Lorton, that was my first experience dealing with a prison. And I was at first shocked by the kinds of searches that they put you through to enter the jail because they don't want you smuggling any contraband in there. And then finally, they led me to a room with William and six other guys, I think it was. And what else shocked me at that time was that I wasn't prepared for how big and buff they were. It wasn't until years later that I realized that since they were the predators of the prison and not the prey, they spent all of their time building up their body, their strength, like MMA fighters or something. And so here I am, this young 25-year-old Black woman in here with six men who have been convicted of raping and murdering women. That was some scary stuff. The only thing I knew to do was to start telling my own rape story because I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anything. I had some books with me, but first I had to see what was up. So I started telling about my own rape story. And then one by one, the guys started telling their own rape stories, both some things that had happened to them when they were children. Some of them had their first rape experience once they got incarcerated, when they were victims, and then how they became predators themselves. And I have to honestly say that after I heard their stories, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I don't know what happened, but it's about those survivor stories that creates bonds and stuff. And so they went on to form a group called Prisoners Against Rape. So I think that's my first calling in experience because I never thought as a rape survivor I would be working with a group of men who had raped and murdered women. And so in my way of revising my own history, I like to think I was conscious at the time that I knew exactly what I was doing or the importance of what I was doing, but of course not. But what happened was that they founded the first men's group to work on to end violence against women, prisoners against rape. A, a video was made about them. They wrote a manifesto about male sexual violence. Um, and eventually, even though I left the Rape Crisis Center 3 years later, I was walking down the streets of Washington, D.C. one day, and I heard this bass voice, Loretta Ross. And I turned around, and there was William Fuller, who I'd never, ever expected to see out of prison. Because one of the things we've done as part of our deal is that we didn't write any letters to the parole board. We didn't smuggle anything in the prison form. We didn't do any of that. It was education only. And so I was kind of scared when I saw him actually walking down the street calling my name. But he told me that he eventually got released from prison. He had gotten married. He had a job in the construction industry. He was very thankful that we had invested some knowledge into him. And I think that's probably my best and first calling in experience, where I had to overcome my fear and see something in somebody else that probably other people would have written off as undeserving. And I wish I'd you know, known at the time, but it's 42 years later. I'm realizing what a fool I was. But now, really, how important that was.
Yes, certainly a powerful moment. So, to follow up on that, a call out is, as we know, the act of publicly shaming another person for a behavior that society or a person deems unacceptable. But you advocate for calling people in, and that's what you just described. Can you explain the difference? What's the difference between calling someone in versus calling them out?
Well, calling in is actually a call out done with love.
Mhm.
So you're still seeking to hold people accountable for the harm that they've done. But instead of using humiliation and shame and anger, you're choosing to use grace, love, and respect to achieve accountability. And basically, if you use grace, love, and respect to achieve accountability, you actually increase the chances that people will want to be held accountable. Because if you're going to come at them with your rage and your anger and your shaming, you're actually encouraging them to either lie or just simply avoid being held accountable. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, how do you decide whether to call somebody in or call somebody out? And I usually start by saying that we all make mistakes. We're not perfect people, we're complicated people. And if a person makes a mistake and they're offered a chance to do better, but they choose not to, nor will they acknowledge the harm that they're doing with their mistake. Sometimes they even double down and try to defend it. Well, that's going to increase the chances that I'm going to call you out because you're not willing to grow. You're not willing to change. You actually maybe you enjoy harming other people. But if you make a mistake and you admit that you caused harm and that you're willing to atone for or repair the harm that you've done, and you have a strategy for doing better in the future, then I'm going to call you in because I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and invest some time into seeing if you really want to change or not. So it's not a matter of whether or not you're a perfect person and you never make mistakes, because that's an impossible bar. But the question is, are you willing to be an adult about your mistakes? Or are you going to be a kid and try to sweep the broken glass under the rug? Or are you going to own up to your mistakes, learn from them, and do better in the future? And so we can teach each other calling in skills that will stick with us for life under every circumstance of our life, whether it's the racist Uncle Frank at the dinner table or the friend who's always late to an appointment, screwing over your time, and instead of dropping that friend in a huff of indignation, you can actually use a calling in technique and figure out why that friend is always late. And do they see it from your perspective? And are they willing to commit to doing something differently? Or sometimes it could be a coworker or somebody in your school, even a professor or a boss. These techniques are pretty universal And what it really requires you to do, first of all, though, is do a self-assessment. Figure out why you want to call somebody in. And the first part of your self-assessment requires remembering how, when you made mistakes as a child, how were they handled? If at the time you made a mistake and people punished you for them or shamed them for them and didn't forgive you for them, then that's probably going to predict how you feel when other people make mistakes. So you're going to lean towards calling people out. But at the time, if the time you made a mistake and people helped you learn from it and forgave you for it, then that's going to predispose you to call people in. And it's amazing how we live these lifetime patterns that are imprinted on our childhood without ever interrogating them, because the behaviors we experience as a child sometimes feel normal to us. So we're supposed to call people out, we think. That's the way you get justice and achieve accountability and make people do the right thing. And I'm pretty sure if I ask you, and is that what happened to you as a child? The answer generally is yes.
Yes, certainly. That's a great point to think about for sure. Thank you. So as our last moderator question, you coined the term reproductive justice. Can you explain what this term is and how is it different from the idea of reproductive rights?
Well, me and 11 other Black women created the term reproductive justice in 1994. And we did so because we were questioning why fighting for abortion rights was always isolated from other social justice issues. So to coin the term, we actually spliced together reproductive rights and social justice, and that's how the term came. But the reason we were interrogating the isolation of abortion from social justice in the first place was because a lot of times when a woman faces an unplanned pregnancy, before she even makes a decision whether or not she's going to keep that pregnancy or not, she's dealing with what's actually going on in her life ahead of time, before the pregnancy. So if she's worried about dropping out of school or losing a job or not having health care, not having a bedroom to put a child in, worrying about violence from her partner if she tells him she's pregnant. I mean, all of those bad answers will probably increase the chances that she won't keep the pregnancy and it'll end in an abortion. But if that same woman has good answers to those questions, she's going to turn an unplanned pregnancy into a baby. And so we critique both the pro-life and the pro-choice movements because they start with the pregnancy instead of what's going on in a person's life before they became pregnant. And so we needed reproductive justice to address the upstream questions, not just the pregnancy questions. And we defined it basically as holding three basic tenets. We joined with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the rights of women to seek and use abortion or birth control or evidence-based sex education, because everyone has the right not to have a child if they don't want to. But the second tenet was based on us being Black women, and that was the right to have the children that we wanted to, because Black women have always been subjected since 1865 to strategies of population control, claiming that we're hyperfertile, that we're Jezebels, that the only time we're a good mother when we're mothering white children, but not our own, those kinds of things. And that led to the development of the birth justice movement that concerns having your birth plan respected if you decide to go to a hospital, using a midwife or a doula if you want to, refusing an unnecessary cesarean section that's often done just for the doctor's convenience, not that it's medically necessary, to look at a whole range of issues that come up when people's reproductive options are not protected, particularly when it comes to having the family that you want to have. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice is the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. And so that brings you into conversation with a lot of other issues that aren't even seen as reproductive politics, because that could be affordable housing or gun violence in your community, or is your community in a food desert, or do you have health care, or is the tax code so prejudiced against your Black community that you do have substandard schools? Or are there environmental toxins that are surrounding your neighborhood, or perhaps that even your neighborhood is built on top of? And so the third tenet, the right to raise your child, our children in safe and healthy environments, is the tenet that brings us into conversation with a lot of other social justice movements. So that's why we call it the organizing tenet, because that means you got to work with the peace movement, the environmental justice movement, the food security movement, the housing justice movement, the on and on and on, just nearly every field of human endeavor. So that was reproductive justice in 1994, how we saw it. But then about 12 years later, our queer people of color within the movement started saying, well, where are we in this framework? And so they added a fourth tenet, and that's the right to bodily autonomy, gender identity, and sexual pleasure as a reproductive justice issue. So in its original incarnation, we talked about three tenets, and now we talk about all four. And it's all based on the human rights framework, because we believe that everything we talk about and demand are in fact inalienable human rights. And we learned about that from what global feminists were doing in the international arena, particularly feminists from the global south, that they used the human rights framework to demand the rights that we were imperfectly securing under the limits of the US Constitution. And so it's a very intersectional framework, but intersectionality is our process. Human rights is our goal.
Certainly a powerful goal, and a goal that we'll keep on having to fight for. So thank you for that detailed answer. Really appreciate that. And we actually have an audience question as we move into audience Q&A that deals with a bit of the same issue. So I'll let Rachel Florman ask her question. We'll let you unmute.
Hi. Sorry, the Zoom technology. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here, Professor Ross. I'm such a huge fan of your work and deeply influenced by it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connections between your reproductive justice work with Sister Song in particular, and the restorative justice work you practiced while working at the Rape Crisis Center and dealing with the men in prison, and how you see those two issues of justice connected.
Well, I'll start with the second question first, because the term and the concept of restorative justice had not been created at the time we were doing this work in the 1970s and early 80s. And so I could call it restorative justice now because it perfectly suits that framework, but we didn't use that with any conscious knowledge. But we knew we were critical of the prison industrial complex, because that's what drove me, to go down to Lorton in the first place, that these were the men from my own Black community who were being warehoused only 20 miles away. And we knew that in dealing with Black rape survivors, that it ended up with the police often committing more violence against our communities than they solved. And so even as a young feminist, I knew that the prison industrial complex was not the solution to ending violence in our communities. And so I'm glad that the restorative and the transformative justice movements have since arisen based on some of these earlier practices to avoid the carceral system that really is not designed to help us, like we're seeing with the trial of Chauvin right now in Minneapolis for the murder of George Floyd. Now, Sister Song came about 3 years after we had created the reproductive justice framework. In 1997, a woman named Luz Rodriguez was at a conference on HIV/AIDS, and she was just having dinner with a Filipino American woman uh, named Rena Marcello, I believe her name was. And Rena had been a program officer at the Ford Foundation. And Rena was complaining about how in her 5 years at Ford, she'd never made a substantive grant to a women of color organization. And it wasn't because she didn't want to, but it was always a capacity issue. You have to have a certain amount of size and financial stability to take a multi-million-dollar grant from Ford. You just can't do it, based on all of us being kitchen table operations and stuff. And so Luce whipped out this napkin and conceptualized Sister Song with 4 Native American, 4 Latina, 4 African American, and 4 Asian Pacific Islander groups coming together to form a collective. And so that allowed Rena to give us $4 million that we distributed among 16 women of color groups. And so that's how Sister Song was founded in 1997. A few years later, we got rid of that 444 arrangement and started letting anybody in who agreed with the principles of reproductive justice, even white women and men, because we felt that our approach was so radical that it ended up appealing to the left wing of the pro-choice movement and the left wing of the pro-life movement, which is kind of interesting because within the 16 groups that originally founded Sister Song, there were some that were pro-choice and there were some that were pro-life, and then there was others that were somewhere in the middle. And so we always had dialogue between the pro-life and the pro-choice factions within our own movement. So it was no big stretch for us to be the place where people could cross the divide in other situations and actually work on shared agendas and things together. So we love the fact that Sister Song was unique in that way as well. And we all agreed on the principles of reproductive justice. And so that's where Sister Song was founded. Right now it's being managed by Monica Simpson, who is the first queer woman to run Sister Song. And she has grown it tremendously. I retired in 2012 and she became my successor. And so she's made it just blow up even bigger than my dreams had it to be. And she certainly proved that you need to invest in young leadership, because it was very hard to persuade my board of directors to give Monica that job, even though she'd been working with us for a year and a half as our development director. And they were hesitant because she'd never led a national organization before. But the reason I believed in Monica was that as I was stepping out of the door and relinquishing responsibility, she kept stepping up to take on more and more and more, even if it wasn't on her job description. So I persuaded the board that we didn't need to do a national search. We had a person right on staff who would be the best fit. And she's lived up to all of my expectations of her, all of my dreams for her. And I'm actually kind of mad at her mama, because I wish I had a daughter that bad. I mean, I'm not really mad at her mama, but you know what I mean. It's just, we wish our children would be all like Monica. And so she's led them to growing larger and more influential, and helping to write, for example, the platform of the Democratic National Committee on reproductive justice when Biden was running and stuff like that. So they've done amazing stuff. And it was their queer people of color community within Sister Song that added that fourth principle.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for your question, Rachel. So on to our next question. This is from an anonymous attendee, so I'll just read it out. What recommendations do you have for getting through to those people whose beliefs we find abhorrent? Is it possible to change?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Okay, perfect. I'll start again. What recommendations do you have for getting through to those people whose beliefs we find abhorrent? Is it possible to change someone's fixed belief, or do they have to want to change?
Well, first of all, they have to want to change, but there's strategies that you can use to help them along the path. But you're not given the magical power to actually change somebody. Otherwise, couples wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight, friends wouldn't fight. So, except first of all, you don't have that magical power. But what you do have is an ability, particularly if you know the person, to go underneath their words. And so I call it my Uncle Frank strategy. Okay, Uncle Frank has a habit of coming to the dinner table and blowing it up with something racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic, or anti-immigrant, or whatever. Uncle Frank delights in being an asshole kind of thing. But you know Uncle Frank, you're his niece. And so you can turn to Uncle Frank after you put in the parking lot your reaction to what he says that always gets you off and y'all start fighting about it. But you can turn to Uncle Frank and say, Uncle Frank, I know you're a kind man. You've been in my life all my life, and in that time, I've watched you help people who are down on their luck. I've watched you, go out of your way to give people a jump if their battery dies. You don't even have to know them, and I know for a fact that you would run into a burning building and save somebody if you could, and you wouldn't even care what race or gender or who they slept with. I know you, Uncle Frank. So, Uncle Frank, since I know you're fundamentally a kind person, help me understand how that kind Uncle Frank has those words come out of his mouth. Help me understand, Uncle Frank. And you neither called him in nor you called him out. You've asked him to address his own, what they call cognitive dissonance, because he has probably a better interior view of himself than he's exhibiting externally. And so a calling in technique would be what I call my Uncle Frank strategy. Build on what's good inside of them. If you can park in the parking lot those things that you're offended by or you disagree with, and help Uncle Frank ask himself the question, is that how I want to walk through the world? Do I want my niece to know the good Uncle Frank, or do I want my niece to know the bad Uncle Frank? Help him to see that he has a choice in that.
Thank you for that strategy. So another question is, what happens from anonymous attendees, what happened when Uncle Frank repents and goes back to hate organizations? So I'll read this question out. How frequently did people who repented for their actions renege and go back to their hate organizations?
Very few people renege on their decisions to go back to their hate organizations because they were hanging around with a bunch of criminals. Criminals aren't going to forgive them easily for defecting in the first place. It's not like quitting the Kiwanis Club or something. You left a bunch of criminals. If they came back, they're going to see you as a possible FBI informant. And so there is no going back to the hate movement once you decided to defect. These are not ethical people. These are not safe people, and they're not that damn smart. And so I've never heard of anybody going backwards. I've heard of people coming there out of those movements. I've never heard anybody say, oh, maybe it wasn't as bad inside as I thought it was. No, I've never heard that ever happening. And I mean, it's kind of like, okay, you're going to quit a criminal organization and then come back and expect them to welcome you with open arms. No, they're going to think that the FBI has flipped you. So you're definitely not going to be safe.
Okay, on to our next anonymous attendee question. Why do you think people seem to prefer calling out to calling in? Do you think it is a desire to feel powerful?
I think sometimes it's ego and power, but sometimes I think it's just people are trying to do the right thing the wrong way. I think that they actually think that they're standing up for principles, that they're standing up for justice, they're standing up for human rights, but they don't recognize that the way to protect human rights is not by violating somebody else's human rights. You're undermining the very framework that you're saying that you're protecting. And so I think sometimes people do it because they want to end harm. They want to hold people accountable. They want to prevent future harms from happening. But then there are people who are just into a woke competition that, oh, you just said the wrong word. Oh, you just used the wrong gender pronoun. Oh, you just don't know that we don't say that anymore. Because they want to show off the knowledge usually that they just recently acquired. But, when you talk to an old hand like me, basically I'm going to say that the fact that you think there's a woke competition really proves how unwoke you really are. you know? And so instead of impressing me, I'm going to be asking a question. Is that person really as naive and foolish as they appear? Or are they a plant by the FBI into our left wing organization, trying to cause disruption and discord and trying to lord it over people by weaponizing their knowledge? I mean, and you don't want to be that person whose presence in a movement makes everybody question your motives and your sincerity. And so there's a lot of reasons people call out. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're questionable. But what I endeavor to do with the online classes, I'm starting a new online class, by the way, on calling in the calling out culture, June 1st. So you can find out more on my website. They're only $5 a lesson for a total of $20. And everybody can afford $20 just about for 4 lessons on how to learn calling in techniques. But anyway, if you'd like to do better, do social justice and human rights work better, then you can learn calling in techniques. And that doesn't mean you ever forsake calling people out, because some people do need to be called out for the way that they're abusing their power or somebody else, or taking advantage of people, or being just basic hypocrites. You do want to have that in your toolkit. I just ask you not to make it your first choice if you haven't tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, if you haven't asked them what's really going on with you, or why do you think that, or those kinds of things, you have a lot of options before you do the denunciation, the blame and shame game.
Awesome. So our next anonymous attendee question is, how has your work with calling out cancel culture changed since the rise of Q-Anon?
Not really changed a whole lot, because cults are cults and they've been with us a very long time. And you got to remember that the first definition of calling out was calling somebody out to a duel. I mean, that's what killed Alexander Hamilton. So we can't just blame it on social media. It's human behavior that is as timeless as long as we've had speech. So it really, the QAnon stuff is a little bit different because it has such a blend of conspiracy, paranoia, and white supremacy attached to it, even though not every QAnon follower is a white supremacist. But let's be honest, not every white person is a white supremacist, and not every white supremacist is white. We know that. But if you're willing to hang out with white supremacists and endorse some of their theories, then you're going to get some shade thrown on you because you haven't scraped them off. Matter of fact, that's what we say about the entire Republican Party right now. Maybe you're not white supremacist, but you have provided too much cover for them for us to not ask you some very pointed questions right now. Because, I mean, generally people who don't steal don't hang around with a lot of thieves. That's just how it works. You're a reflection of the company you keep. And so with QAnon, again, sometimes it's really catching up to us that we end up with family members in these cults. There used to be a group called the Cult Awareness Network, and there used to be all kinds of black holes people fell into, and QAnon is just the latest and probably the most openly political because it's trying to overthrow the government, as opposed to those that just think that everybody in the cult think that they know secret information nobody else knows, kind of thing. That's kind of like goes along with that cultish belief. And it's the believers against the non-believers, or the sheeple, as they call it, who haven't woken up yet, or who just refuse to see the evidence that these cultists lay out before them. But they take a lot of pride in believing that they figured out something the rest of the world is unaware of. And so it's going to be a lot of work And it's usually best done by experts to deprogram people who are convinced fundamentally that they're smarter than the rest of the world because they've got their whole ego riding on these cultish beliefs. And it's a task. Now, like I said, the Cult Awareness Network and professionals can handle it, but generally we can't handle it with family members and stuff like that because we don't have the skills and we're too invested in getting it right. And they're not at all invested in listening. So it's generally a losing proposition until they wake up themselves.
Thank you for your response. We'll go to our next question from Kellen Love. So Kellen, we'll let you unmute.
Hi, very cool. Thanks again for coming out. My question is really related, I guess, more to cancel culture. I've been doing a lot of work, I think, in the past maybe 3 months on prison abolition, just kind of understanding that as a concept and idea. And I think I see some similarities between like cancel culture and carceral culture, but obviously I'm not the expert, so I was defer to you and kind of maybe parse out what similarities you see, and maybe what like best practices, in taking down one can be transmitted to the other.
Well, I actually do analogize the cancel culture to prison culture, because it uses the same techniques of ostracism, isolation, punishment, exiling from the community. I mean, it's just a scaled up version of it done by the state as opposed to done by a mob online or something like that. And I always ask the question, how can you be a prison abolitionist and use the cancel culture at the same time? Because you're contradicting your own work. And so there's a lot of similarities. It's just one is scaled up. One is done by the state, and the other may be done by churches, communities, people who want Harry Potter canceled or those kinds of things. But it's all around intolerance and and reserving for yourself the right to decide what's acceptable, what's right, what's wrong. And they're based on a very primitive binary system. Like some people are good, some people are bad, and I want to be the good people punishing the bad people. And these false binaries are really what get people in trouble because they don't recognize or admit that people are remarkably complicated. And you have to at least accept that other people are as complicated as you are. And so we all have good stuff that we do that we're proud of and bad stuff that we do that we're not so proud of. And so when you see yourself realistically, you actually can reject what I call the PIC, the prison industrial complex, and really interrogate how can you build a human rights movement by using the master's tools, as Audre Lorde once asked, because the master's tool will never take down the master's house. And what concerns me is that if we don't use a human rights-based value system for our work, then we're just fighting for equal opportunity to oppress others. We just want our turn at the top of the oppression pyramid. We don't really want to change oppression, just who manages it. And so it's really important for me to help people understand that the prison industrial complex is the logical endpoint to the cancel culture.
Our next anonymous attendee question is, how have you seen people use social media to call in? Sometimes it seems like people use it overwhelmingly to call out.
Well, I like teaching people how to use social media to call in. First of all, I curated what people who were like call out queens and kings on social media, how they felt about themselves. And for the most part, almost uniformly, they said, I don't like who I become online. I'm ashamed of what I used to do to people. I really don't even want anybody to know I used to act like that because I'm ashamed of it. And so once I curated that knowledge, then I could intervene on social media and just interrupt the call out and say, wait a moment, are you sure that you want to say that to somebody else? And would you be able to look that statement in the eye without shame tomorrow? Would you say that if your name was attached to it instead of just an avatar? I mean, if you can't say, be proud of your words, why are you uttering them in the first place? If you're not proud of your behavior, why are you doing it in the first place? You do have choices, you know? And so I'm not that much into social media, to be honest. And my most famous saying is that my twat don't tweet. So I don't know a lot about Twitter and all the other things. I actually have hired people to manage my social media profile for me. Well, I tell them what to say, but they're the ones that spend all the time doom scrolling and saying it. And so, and then sometimes I just turn it off. I mean, not turn it off like disengage from social media, but I don't go down the rabbit holes with people. So once they start a call out thing, I'll say something like, "Are you sure this is where you want to take this conversation? If so, I'm checking out." We had a big social media attack on the Pink Pussy March, the Women's March, when Trump was first inaugurated. And a lot of women of color were just calling out the women who had organized the march because it was first conceptualized by a white woman who apparently was relatively clueless because she didn't know that there had been other million woman marches before. So she called for a million woman march that made a whole lot of black people mad because there'd been the Million Men's March and the Million Women Marches, and she didn't have this historical lens. And so it ended up being a circular firing squad of critique. Well, I'm not going to go. It's just white women. White women voted for Trump. I can't do this. And they don't know what they're doing. And they're co opting women of color and all this. That was just going on. And I would just sometimes wade into the fray. I said, well, have you considered that the women who are organizing a protest against Trump may not be the ones who voted for him? I mean, really? Use some logic here. So you're hating on them because of their identity, not their politics, apparently. And so who gives you the right to hate somebody else's identity? Because there's a difference between an ideology and an identity. Just because they're white doesn't mean they're white supremacists. Just because you're black don't mean you know about black liberation. Just because you have a vagina doesn't mean you know about feminism. Identity is just identity. It is not secret knowledge to anything. And so I spent a lot of time on social media trying to pull back all the critique that people were lobbying against the Pink Pussy March. Um, Now, I did have one funny story to tell you, if you don't mind me spending a little time on it. One of my dearest friends is a deeply devout Christian woman who is Black, but she thinks she's the Martha Stewart of the Black community because she's always crafting things, always knitting, crocheting, making quilts, those kinds of things. So I'd asked Juanita if she would make some hats for the Pink Pussy March. And so she decided to recruit her church group. And she was the only Black woman with all these elderly grandmother white women in rural South Carolina. And she asked them if they would knit these pink pussy hats. And of course, they just blanched. We can't say that word. We can't deal with that. They were just all over the place saying, we can't say that word. And it wasn't the politics, it was the fact that they were too self-conscious to say the P word, right? And so Anita came up with the brilliant strategy of teaching them to sing something they already knew how to sing, which is, "What's new, pussycat? Whoa, whoa, whoa," this old Tom Jones song. And she produced hundreds of pink pussy hats using her religious craft circle, singing Tom Jones songs. That's a calling in strategy. I love it when Juanita told me that story. I was like, well, how did you get them to do it? We just started singing "What's New, Pussycat?" because they had gotten permission to sing that song. So they would sing it and they kept knitting and they produced a bunch of hats.
Thank you for that. So is it okay? I just want to be respectful of time if we ask two short questions to close out. Perfect. Thank you so much. So one anonymous attendee is asking, why do you refrain from calling call-out culture cancel culture? How is it different? The difference between your idea and the way the term is being politically said by those on the right.
Well, call out culture is a milder form of cancel culture. So I use them interchangeably. But when you move from calling people out to demanding that they get fired, you're trying to get them canceled, because the original definition of canceling was canceling a TV show. So it's basically the same continuum. It's just one is a more extreme punishment than the other. Uh, Calling somebody out is basically offering them a chance to correct their ways and remaining in integrity with people. Canceling them, you're not even trying to get them to apologize or make any correction. You're just trying to punish them by exiling them from either losing a job, deplatforming, that kind of thing. So it's all on the same continuum. I use them rather interchangeably depending on the audience and the circumstances.
Thank you. And then our last question from Rachel. We'll let Rachel unmute and ask this question.
Hi, thank you again. Yeah, my last question is, what gives you hope right now?
Well, a lot of things give me hope. First of all, I think I'm a naturally optimistic person, which works a lot, because even when the most horrible things happened to me in my childhood, I never gave up on myself. My mother actually said that to me. My mother used to read the Reader's Digest all the time. And so she always had these little pithy sayings that it took me a while to figure out that she was actually reading them from the Reader's Digest. But anyway, she said one of the things that she admired about me was that I didn't let success go to my head. And I was like, oh, Ma, yeah, right. I've heard that before. And she said, shut up, Loretta, because you never shut up. Let me finish. She said, you don't let success go to your head, but you don't let failure go to your heart. And I said, Ma, that was like the most wonderful thing my mother had ever said to me. And it felt so profound. But because I became a social justice activist at 16, which was my first year in college when I first got tear gassed, protesting the death of Martin Luther King and what was happening around racial justice at that time, I learned to party as hard as I work. So I was definitely a party animal, when I was young. And I usually partied with totally apolitical people. So there was a toggle switch inside of my consciousness where I could turn it off when I didn't need it and I just wanted to shake my booty and dance and have a good time. And then there was a time I could turn it back on. And so I compare that to nowadays, the way I had to toggle off my consciousness in order to watch Twilight. I didn't want to do a critical feminist analysis of what was going on between Bella, Edward, and Jake. I just wanted to enjoy the damn movie. And so you need to party as hard as you work. You need to have a toggle switch. You need to not think that you're in control of a time horizon, because social change is slow work to change people's hearts and minds. So you're not the boss of time. You got to just what someone told me from the civil rights movement is that stop thinking yourself as the entire chain of freedom. Just try to be the strongest link in the chain of freedom, so that the chain doesn't break at you, kind of thing. And so that helped me learn about proportion and timelines and stuff. And I think the final thing I'll say about it is I get a lot of hope from young people because I'm surrounded by them. I teach them all the time. But Leonard Zeskin, who I talked about before, my research director, who I replaced, he saw me being oh so serious because we were at the National Anti-Klan Network. We had to investigate a lot of murders of Black people, sometimes Black women and children. And that could be very depressing work. And he said, Loretta, lighten up. He said, fighting Nazis should be fun. He said, it's being a Nazi that sucks. And he gave me perspective I've never lost. If you're not having fun doing the righteous work of human rights, you're doing something wrong.